He stood at the school gates, holding a worn backpack and a dream too big for his tiny frame. They didn't let him in. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked potential, but because he didn't have the right clothes, the right connections, or the right amount of money. That rejection followed him home, followed him through the years, and planted a fire in his heart that never went out. Decades later, that same boy, once turned away without a chance, walked back through those gates, not as a visitor, not as a student, but as the principal. He was just a child, but even then, he understood the difference between being rejected and being unwanted. The morning he arrived at the school gates, he carried no illusions, only hope. His mother had spent weeks scraping together the money for the admission form, skipping meals without saying a word, cutting corners where none existed. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. She had washed his school clothes the night before, and though they were faded and worn thin at the elbows, he'd ironed them himself until every wrinkle was gone. He had polished his shoes with cooking oil because there was no proper polish in the house. Even the way he carried the form, neatly folded, edges aligned, spoke of a boy trying desperately to show he was ready, deserving, worthy. But when he stepped inside the office, the reality hit hard. The receptionist barely looked up. The school clerk, seated comfortably in his chair, glanced over the top of his glasses, not at the form, but at the boy. Then at his mother, at her cracked hands, her frayed dupatta, her nervous smile. There were no words exchanged at first, just expressions. Expressions that made it clear they had already decided who belonged there and who didn't. When they finally spoke, the answer came without emotion. Admissions are closed. No apology, no explanation, no second glance. He wanted to argue, but even at that age he recognized the finality in their tone, the kind of voice that made you feel like any resistance would only humiliate you further. He stepped out of that room with a hollow feeling in his chest. It wasn't just disappointment, it was the kind of ache that settles when you realize the world doesn't play fair. They hadn't rejected his grades. They hadn't even asked about them. They'd rejected what he represented: poverty, struggle, the absence of status. He wasn't denied for what was on the page. He was denied for what they saw before they even turned the first one. And that burned more than any failed test ever could. His mother tried to smile for his sake. She said they'd try another school, but they both knew this one was the best in the area. It was where success stories began, and it had just slammed the door in their faces. That night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too young to have the words for what he felt, but old enough to understand it. He thought of all the students who were accepted, children who arrived, in clean uniforms, dropped off by cars with tinted windows, carrying bags full of supplies and confidence. He didn't resent them, but he couldn't help wondering what made them so different. Was it just money? Was that all it took to be seen, to be welcomed, to be believed in? Yeah, the rejection didn't just stay at school. It followed him in how neighbors talked, how relatives treated his mother like she'd asked for too much by hoping too high. It showed up in the whispers, in the awkward silence when someone asked where he was going to study. He began to shrink inward, trying not to dream too loudly. Because dreaming, he learned, was expensive, and boys like him weren't supposed to dream beyond their place. But somewhere beneath the hurt, something else took root. A stubborn sense of worth, still small, still fragile, but alive. He didn't have the language for resilience yet. He didn't know what words like perseverance or injustice meant. But he knew this much. He didn't want to feel this way again. He didn't want to stand on the other side of the gate ever again, knowing he wasn't even given a chance. And though he didn't know how or when, he promised himself something that night. That one day they would remember the boy they turned away, not because he caused trouble, but because he came back stronger, not to ask for entry, but to hold the key. Being denied admission didn't mean he stopped learning. It only meant he had to learn differently. While other children sat inside classrooms with clean benches and blackboards, he learned through cracks, through windows left slightly open, through pages left behind, through overheard lessons and half-understood diagrams. He borrowed textbooks from older cousins, neighbors, and anyone willing to lend. Most of them were torn, outdated, scribbled in, but to him they were treasure. He would sit with them for hours, reading slowly, repeating each line to himself until it made sense. Some nights he didn't have light. When the electricity was cut, he'd wait until the moon was strong enough or sit outside beneath a street lamp, brushing away mosquitoes as he copied notes into the back of old grocery receipts. There were no study tables, no silence, no helping hands. There was just his will, and it had to be louder than everything trying to silence it. His mother did what she could. She couldn't teach him algebra or science, but she gave him space to try. She encouraged him in small ways, keeping his books safe, giving up her part of the blanket so he could study longer at night, saving coins to buy second-hand notebooks. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes but never heard a complaint. Her belief in him was quiet but constant. It made him feel seen, even when the world turned away. Others weren't so kind. Neighbors questioned why he bothered. Some said it was pointless, to aim so high with so little. They'd shake their heads when they saw him writing on scraps of paper or repeating vocabulary words to himself as he swept the porch. He should learn a trade, they'd say. School is for children who can afford it. But what they didn't see was that he wasn't chasing grades or a certificate. He was chasing something deeper. Dignity. A place in the world where he could be heard without having to shout, where he didn't have to beg to be let in, where knowledge wasn't a privilege for the few, but a weapon for the quiet, the unseen, the determined. He began to create his own rhythm. He'd listen to older students when they studied in groups on the street or read aloud while walking home from school. He memorized formulas by turning them into rhymes. He used chalk to write on walls when he couldn't afford paper. Every moment was a lesson, every mistake, every misunderstanding, every correction. He didn't have access to tutors or coaching centers, but he learned how to teach himself. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't smooth, but it was relentless. His hunger for knowledge didn't come from the promise of a job or a salary. It came from the knowledge that education was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. Money could disappear. Homes could fall apart. Even family could be lost. But no one could erase what he had learned. That belief became his anchor. He didn't study for applause. He studied because it gave him power, silent power, the kind no one could touch. Over time, his self-discipline became unshakable. He woke up before dawn to revise. He stayed up past midnight reviewing equations and translating passages. Even when sleep pulled at his eyes and hunger knotted in his stomach, he pressed on. He told himself that one day he'd walk into a school, not to beg for a seat, but to create seats for others like him. That dream, though distant, kept him moving. Every word he read, every fact he understood, every lesson he wrestled with, each was a small rebellion against the belief that poor children should know their place. He didn't want pity. He didn't want handouts. He wanted a future built by his own hands. And even though he had no classroom, no teacher, and no desk, he knew one thing for certain. No one could lock him out of knowledge unless he let them. And he never would. His journey into formal education began not with a grand opportunity, but with a modest chance. An opening at a small, overlooked community school in a nearby neighborhood. It was the kind of place that didn't ask for entrance. Exam results didn't turn away students who couldn't afford uniforms and didn't judge a child by their shoes. It lacked resources, but it had something more important: open doors. And for a boy who had grown up learning in shadows and margins, that was enough. He stepped into the classroom quietly, carrying no expectations from others but a fierce determination burning inside. He listened closely, took notes obsessively, and asked questions without shame. It didn't matter if the chairs wobbled or the blackboard was cracked. He treated every lecture like it was sacred. What others took for granted, he cherished. He soon stood out, not for his appearance or background, but for his hunger to learn. His teachers began to notice the way he absorbed everything, how he stayed behind after class, how he helped other students struggling to keep up. He didn't see education as a competition. He saw it as salvation. While others left school and went home to play or rest, he went straight to work. He swept floors, washed dishes, and sometimes cleaned the very classroom he studied in. Whatever it took to afford notebooks, pens, and the next day's meal, he did it without hesitation. There were days he showed up to school with sore hands and sleepless eyes, but never without focus. His grit became his identity. There were no shortcuts, no favors, just the long, steady climb built on effort alone. By the time board exams came around, he was ready. He studied late into the night, sometimes waking at dawn to revise under a weak ceiling fan, and when the results were announced, his name was printed near the top, among students from schools with better buildings, better teachers, and far more privilege. That moment didn't change his life overnight, but it cracked something open. He applied for scholarships, each application a reminder of how far he had come. Slowly, opportunities started to appear. He got into college based on merit, not influence. He wore second-hand clothes and carried books in a stitched-up bag, but he sat in the same lecture halls as students who had once lived in a different world, and he never forgot that. Instead of envy, he chose gratitude. Instead of resentment, he chose discipline. College wasn't easy. There were subjects he had never encountered before, and gaps in his early education showed. But he filled them with persistence. He became the student who sat in the library until closing, the one who never missed a lecture, who asked for clarification without embarrassment. His questions weren't fueled by insecurity, but by clarity. He knew what was at stake. Every assignment, every exam, every book read was a step away from where he started and closer to the vision he held in his heart. That vision wasn't of wealth or fame, it was of service. He wanted to teach, not just because he loved knowledge, but because he had lived the cost of being denied it. He wanted to be the kind of educator who saw potential before privilege, the kind who noticed the quiet student in the corner and asked what they needed. He earned his teaching degree with distinction and later pursued a master's in education. Alongside his studies, he volunteered in low-income schools, tutoring students who reminded him of his own past. He saw in their eyes the same hunger, the same uncertainty, the same quiet strength. And each time he stood before them, he didn't see it as a position of power. He saw it as responsibility. He had climbed not to rise above, but to lift others. He didn't forget the rejection. He didn't forget the laughter, the closed doors, the quiet judgments. But he also didn't let those moments define him. They became part of his foundation, not his identity. His success wasn't built to silence those who doubted him. It was built to speak for those who never had a voice to begin with. Years passed, and with each one his name quietly began to carry weight in the world of education. He wasn't famous. He wasn't featured in magazines or celebrated on stages. But among those who paid attention, teachers, mentors, school boards, his work spoke for itself. The schools he touched saw change, not just in numbers or test scores, but in the hearts of students who had once felt invisible. He had a gift for seeing what others missed. When he walked into a classroom, he didn't just assess performance. He read the room, noticed the anxious child in the back, the one pretending to be okay, the one like he once was. Over time, he became the kind of educator people trusted when they wanted something to be rebuilt, not just managed. It was during one such ordinary week, when he was mentoring young teachers and guiding a struggling school through a curriculum shift, that the unexpected happened. A phone call. The voice on the other end was formal but sincere. It was from the same institution that had once denied him a place as a student, the school where he had stood outside the gates holding a dream too small to be seen. The school that had once looked through him. The principal was retiring. The board had been discussing new leadership. They wanted someone with strong values, someone with lived experience, someone who understood more than theory. His name had come up, repeatedly. Would he consider applying? For a moment he didn't speak, not out of shock, but reflection. He remembered everything. The look in the receptionist's eyes, the hollow walk home, the ache in his mother's silence. And now the same place was asking him to return, not as a visitor, not as a teacher, but as its leader. The irony was undeniable. But so was the opportunity. He didn't accept right away. He allowed himself the time to think it through. This wasn't just about closure. It wasn't about proving a point. If he said yes, it had to be for the right reason. Not revenge, not validation, but transformation. Could he go back and reshape the very system that once locked him out? He thought about the children walking through those gates today. Some came from wealth. Others came from nothing. Many, he imagined, felt the same way he once did, uncertain, intimidated, unsure if they belonged. He thought about the teachers, about the ones who still held unconscious bias, about the office staff who might still judge a child by the creases in their uniform or the language their parents spoke at home. He thought about policy, access, culture, change. Could he lead not just with competence, but with compassion? Could he create a place where no child ever had to stand outside and feel like they didn't deserve a seat? His answer came in the form of calm resolve. Yes, he would return, but not to correct a wrong, to build something right. He submitted his application with clarity and confidence, attaching a letter that spoke not of ambition, but of responsibility. The board didn't hesitate. His qualifications, experience, and reputation spoke louder than any introduction ever could. When the offer was made official, he accepted with quiet pride. Returning to that school wasn't about walking through familiar hallways. It was about stepping into purpose. He didn't arrive with a chip on his shoulder. He arrived with a vision. To create a school where brilliance wasn't measured by appearance, where entry wasn't determined by background, and where education was treated as a birthright, not a privilege. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Change rarely is. But he also knew the cost of doing nothing. He had lived it. In choosing to return, he wasn't just answering an offer. He was answering every child who had ever been turned away, overlooked, or underestimated. And this time, he had the keys. Not just to the building, but to the future. He stepped into his role not as a man seeking validation, but as a man carrying a vow. Becoming principal wasn't a destination for him. It was a responsibility, a deeply personal mission shaped by the pain of his own childhood. He didn't redecorate the office first. He didn't start with speeches or press releases. He started with listening. To teachers, to staff, most of all, to students, especially the ones who didn't speak much. He paid attention to the quiet ones, the kids whose eyes always found the floor before they found courage, the ones who didn't quite fit the mold. He remembered what it felt like to be them, to be bright but invisible, capable but dismissed. And so he made it clear from the beginning. This school would not measure worth by uniforms, accents, or report cards. It would measure it by effort, honesty, and the courage to try. One of the first changes he made was to the admission policy. He ensured no child would be turned away simply for lacking money, documents, or polish. He created a fund from alumni donations and community partnerships, quietly, without fanfare, to cover admission and supplies for those who needed it most. He didn't want a scholarship that made a child feel different. He wanted an environment where no one could tell who paid full fees and who didn't. Because learning, he believed, should happen on equal ground. His approach to leadership was not about command. It was about care. He asked teachers not just about test scores, but about how many students smiled that day. He encouraged staff to call parents not only when a child misbehaved, but when they showed improvement. He arranged workshops that trained teachers in emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity. He added a feedback box for students, anonymous, judgment-free, and always read personally by him. He reminded everyone that a school was not just a place of academic instruction. It was often the only safe space some children would know. Culture began to change. Slowly but unmistakably. Children from poorer backgrounds stopped sitting in the last rows by habit. Parents who once hesitated to attend meetings started showing up with pride. Staff started noticing the difference in how they spoke to students, how they listened, how they assumed less and asked more. The school that once denied a poor boy without even opening his form was becoming a place that looked for promise, not polish. On his desk sat a small framed piece of paper. Yellowed with time, slightly torn at the edges, it was the original admission form his mother had filled out all those years ago, the one that had been rejected without a second glance. He kept it there not out of bitterness but as a reminder, a symbol of what should never happen again. Every morning before he began his day, he looked at that form, not for motivation, but for grounding. To remember the weight of being told no, for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. To remember that every decision he made now had the power to shape or shatter someone else's future. He didn't expect to be thanked. He didn't want to be celebrated. What mattered most to him was knowing that if a boy like he once was walked into that office today, he wouldn't be sent away. He would be seen. He would be welcomed. And maybe, years down the line, he would walk those same halls with his own sense of purpose. That, to him, was the real legacy. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could change the future. For hundreds of children who deserved more than silence at the gate. And in doing so, he fulfilled not just a position, but a promise. A promise to honor the child he had once been, and to never, ever let another one believe they weren't enough.